Okay, so we're going to solve some quadratic equations. First, a little bit of a warm-up. If you're multiplying those two complex numbers together, make sure you use the distributive property. And you have some like terms you can combine. Don't forget to turn I squared into -1. So then you have 2 times -1 gives you a -2. You can do your 8i plus 3i and get 11i. And then your -2 plus 12 gets you 10. Solving some quadratic equations, we're first going to solve using the zero factor property, which basically just tells you that if you have two things that are being multiplied together and you know the result is 0, then either one or both of the two things that are being multiplied has to be equal to 0. So for example, if I have those two binomials multiplied together, either x is 1 or -3. So what we want to do is, when we're solving a quadratic using the zero factor property, get 0 on one side first, and then figure out the two factors that are being multiplied to get you that expression. So if you factor this one, might take a couple guesses, but it factors into 4x minus 1 and 2x plus 3. So your possible solutions are whatever x values make each of those factors equal to 0. So you could take and set 4x minus 1 equal to 0 and 2x plus 3 equal to 0. Solve each one, so you'd have to add 1 and divide by 4 to get 1/4. And then subtract 3 and divide by 2 would get you -3/2. And those are your two solutions to that quadratic equation. This one's pretty much the same. Again, if you don't have 0 on one side first, go ahead and rearrange your equation to get 0 on one side. So I'm going to add 1 to both sides. And then just a little bit more factoring. You can factor this one into 3x plus 1 and x plus 1, I think. Always make sure to double check your factoring. And then if you set each factor equal to 0, you're going to end up with x equals -1/3 and x equals -1. C is just slightly more complicated because it takes more work to rearrange your equation. So you could move things over to either side, but I like to keep my quadratic term positive, so I would add the 3x to both sides and subtract 2. That looks a little bit harder to factor as well, so if you don't want to guess and check, don't forget that you can use our other method where you figure out the two numbers that multiply to a times c, so to 10 times -18, which is -180, and they have to add up to the 3x in the middle. So things that multiply to -180, 16/3 doesn't work. -12 and +15 will work to add up to 3. So you can rewrite the 3x term as a -12x plus a 15x, and then do a little bit of factoring by grouping. So I'm going to group my first two together and factor out a 2x, which will leave you with 5x minus 6. My second two terms, or my last third and fourth term, I'm going to factor out a 3, which will leave me 5x minus 6. Then you could take out your common factor of 5x minus 6 and be left with 2x plus 3. So however you got there, whether it was guessing and checking or factoring by grouping, set each factor equal to 0 and see what values of x you come up with. Okay, you guys are pros at that by now. So let's do a different method, which is solving by square roots. So if you don't have a term with just x to the first, if you only have your variable being squared, you can get your variable by itself by doing the inverse of second power, which is taking the square root of both sides. When you do that, you're going to have both the positive and the negative value, because if you think about x squared being equal to 4, both positive and -2 will get you back to 4. So if I take the square root on this one, I'll end up with x equals positive and negative square root is 13. Doesn't break down, so that's it. Here, if you do the square root of -16, you'll have to factor out your I, and that'll just leave you with plus or minus 4i. The part of this that is a perfect square is your 2x plus 6. So get the part that is a perfect square by itself before you take the square root of both sides of your equation. So taking the square root of that 2x plus 6 to the second power just gives you 2x plus 6. And then you are going to have positive and negative square root of negative 96, which we're going to have to break down. Make a little factor tree of things that multiplies to 96. And also, don't forget that we do have a negative 1 times our 96, so we will end up with an I when we take the square root of this as well. So we can bring out a factor of 2 factors of 2. So square root of negative 96 is going to break down into 4i times, we've got a factor of 2 and a factor of 3 left inside. So we're going to have 4i times the square root of 6. So rewriting our square root of negative 96. Then we have to work to get our variable actually solved for. So subtract 6 from both sides, or I would just write it as negative 6 plus or minus 4i times the square root of 6. Divide everything by 2. You can divide every factor in there by 2, so it ends up being negative 3 plus or minus, I forgot the minus there in my writing, 2i times the square root of 3.